William Golding was born in 1911 in Cornwall, England, to Alec and Mildred Golding. His father was a science master at Marlborough College, and his mother was an activist for women's rights. He was raised by his father, and it is probably because of his influence that Golding chose to enroll in Oxford College as a natural science major. However, after 2 years, Golding switched majors, giving in to his lifelong interest in English literature. When he was 28 years old, Golding married Anne Brookfield. They had 2 children. When World War II began, Golding joined the Royal Navy. He spent much time in action, even participating in the invasion of Normandy. After the war, Golding returned home and began his career as a schoolteacher and author. His first book, Lord of the Flies, was published in 1954. His subsequent works, The Inheritors, Pincher Martin, and Free Fall, proved profitable enough that Golding was able to quit his job as a schoolteacher and write full-time. He continued to write for quite some time, releasing many books and essays before his death in 1993. Golding's literary works have earned him numerous awards and acknowledgments. The ones listed below are only a few. Of all of William Golding's works, The Lord of the Flies was by far the most successful. Though it was first published in 1954, it did not become widely known until the 1960s, when it became popular among many counterculture organizations. Initially, the book faced some tough resistance from conservative censorship groups which disliked the book's dark depiction of human nature and violent themes. However, as time wore on, the book was acknowledged as a legitimate piece of literature. Before long, it was being proclaimed by literary critics throughout the United States as one of the greatest books of the century. Since publication, The Lord of the Flies has been adapted to film twice, once in 1963 and then again in 1990. Although originally quite controversial, The Lord of the Flies has become a staple of high school literature courses throughout the country. Today, more than half a century since its first publication, The Lord of the Flies still sells at a consistently considerable rate. The Lord of the Flies tells the story of a group of English schoolboys who find themselves stranded on an island without any adult supervision. From the start, it is quite evident there are some distinct personality differences between the boys on the island. Eventually, there is a split in the group and conflict ensues. It is clear that William Golding intends the island and its human inhabitants to serve as a microcosm for the world and mankind. Through a fascinating series of motifs, descriptions, and metaphors, Golding communicates to the reader a series of theories regarding human nature. One of the book's major themes is the ideological conflict between civilization and savagery. When they arrive on the island, the boys behave very much like any other group of children would have. They make an attempt to recreate civilization on the island by building shelters and electing various individuals to serve as leaders. As time passes, the boys gradually drift away from their elected leader, Ralph, and begin to follow another boy, Jack. It is clear from the start that Jack is more interested in immediate gratification and recreation than long-term solutions. Eventually, this lack of foresight and self-centeredness grows to the point where Jack and his followers are reduced to savages. In The Lord of the Flies, William Golding portrays mankind as an inherently cruel race, controlled only by civilization and lifetimes of social conditioning. After a short amount of time on the island, many of the boys become oddly cruel toward one another. They seem to get deep gratification from killing the island's pigs and often have violent reenactments of their hunts. One boy in particular becomes particularly renowned for the gleefully cruel manner in which he treats the younger defenseless boys. By the end of the book, the majority of the boys have overcome their past social conditioning and are always ready to maliciously attack one another. Without society to keep them in check, these young, not yet conditioned boys begin to show the dark nature which is inherent to all mankind. Throughout the novel, Golding uses a series of symbols and metaphors to help explain his theories. One of the most civilized characters in the book, Piggy, wears glasses. In addition to being the boys' only means of starting a fire, the glasses come to represent civilization and the apparent weakness of those who live in it. Ultimately, the glasses, like the boys' attempts at civilization, are shattered. Another object which makes numerous appearances is the conch shell. At the beginning of the book, it is used to call the boys together by Ralph and later serves as a means of regulating the boys' assemblies. It, like Piggy's glasses, comes to represent civilization. It is also of note that the conch, a typically fragile shell, ends up smashed into thousands of pieces. Where the conch shell and glasses represent civilization, the signifier which the boys light in the hope of rescue represents the desire to return to it. As the book goes on, the boys become increasingly uncivilized, and they begin to neglect the signifier, preferring instead to hunt. By the end of the book, the signifier is all but abandoned. It is, however, of note that in the last scene of the book, the boys' own savagery and thirst for cruelty leads them to light the entire island on fire. Ultimately, it is this fire that gets them rescued and returned to civilization. Just as water cools fastest when it is boiling, the boys are able to return to their civilized state only once they have succumbed to their own savagery. Perhaps the most important symbol of all is the Lord of the Flies himself. Physically, the Lord of the Flies is a pig's head covered in insects. Metaphorically, the Lord of the Flies is the embodiment of all society's evil, an entity capable of evoking the savagery within every individual. It is no mere coincidence that the Hebrew equivalent of the word devil, Beelzebub, translates fairly accurately to Lord of the Flies. There are numerous other symbols throughout the book, the meanings of which vary from reader to reader. There are also a series of interesting, albeit cryptic, religious references in The Lord of the Flies. At what point in the story, Simon, a character of notable generosity and virtue, discovers that the alleged beast of whom all the boys had been frightened is no more than the corpse of a man. When he goes to spread this redeeming bit of information, he is physically torn apart by his savage, frightened comrades. At another point in the book, Simon has a hallucinatory conversation with the Lord of the Flies, during which he is tempted by the idea of succumbing to his own inner savagery and desires. An oddly similar scene exists in the Bible when Jesus Christ is tempted by the devil in the desert. It is undeniable that Golding intended Simon to serve as a Christ figure, but unlikely that he intended the Lord of the Flies to serve as an accurate religious allegory. The themes and ideas expressed in The Lord of the Flies can also be found in other pieces of literature. A prime example of this exists in Richard Connell's famous short story, The Most Dangerous Game. Like The Lord of the Flies, The Most Dangerous Game deals with humanity's dark inner nature, a nature that often drives us to torture and even hunt one another. There are also numerous novels and stories such as Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz or George Orwell's Animal Farm, which, like The Lord of the Flies, are intended to relate key aspects of human nature through allegorical tales. Ultimately, The Lord of the Flies will remain a powerfully meaningful tale and a timeless allegory.